God saved President Trump. There's no other explanation. He saved him thus far from prison. He saved him from being unelectable because he's supposedly a 36-time felon. God has stepped in. Meanwhile, President Trump's RNC has made the decision to turn their back on God. A mild reading, a casual reading, in fact, a narrative overview of the Old Testament is a series of betrayals the Jewish people thrust into the face of God. You rescued us from Egypt, but we want meat. Well, this man is no good. Give us meat. What have you done, Moses? You've taken us out here to die? When Moses ascended the mountain to go see the face of God, which few people have survived, on the ground, he and his brother Aaron helped the Jewish people go back to worshiping false idols. And if you read that scene, you understand when they talk about celebrating, they were talking about sexual orgies at the feet of a false god, just like they were taught to do in Egypt. They turned their back on God. A generation would pass before the Jewish people would enter the promised land. Moses never got to walk into the promised land. It's a story. It's history of a people chosen by God turning their back on him. I'll give you an example of what I mean by President Trump's RNC turning their back on God. First, though, from ABC. This is from Martha Raddatt's show, and she is going to continue to blame the Trump shooting on Trump himself. Listen to this, or watch it.
We have to point out, no matter who the shooter, what the shooter's motives were, no matter who the shooter is, you are going to hear conspiracy theories going forward.
No question about that. But as you point out, those statements from J.D. Vance and Vivek Ramaswamy, of course, President Trump and his supporters have contributed to this violent rhetoric as well.
Well, absolutely, George. We were just looking back this morning at some of the things that former President Trump has said. He warned last March of potential death and destruction if he were charged by the Manhattan District Attorney. Our country is being destroyed as they tell us to be peaceful. Trump in January warned of bedlam in the country if the criminal charges against him succeeded. And of course, in March, he said, now, if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole. That's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. That will be the least of it. He said he was partly joking and that was taken out of context.
No, it was taken out of context, and you just did it again. He spoke specifically of the automotive sector, specifically about an economic bloodbath, specifically. And we can go back and show the figurehead and people like the figurehead using the same language in the past year. It's common parlance in D.C. But this is how Martha Raddatz chooses to present this. The same entities that presented President Trump as a threat to the existence of so-called people, of gay people, of black people, of Hispanic people, and of so-called migrants. And there are such a thing as migrants, but of course they mean illegal immigrants. They just don't say that phrase. The same people who prepped the environment to beg for an assassination of President Trump are now stepping back to say it's Trump's fault. Was it Trump's fault that the Secret Service created this as a loose security event? I don't think so. Now, when President Trump turned his head to read that chart, you know the story. The bullet passes through his ear. It hits a spectator behind him. It goes in then to a tractor, which is having its hydraulics hold up lighting. That collapsed. Another bullet went through the retired volunteer fire chief. He was killed protecting his family. We can watch this all. But what you can't watch as easily was behind the scenes, the sellout to God. This is remarkable to me. President Trump's big mistake in office, his huge mistake, was allowing Tony Fauci to seize control of the country. His second big mistake was allowing around him people who are wedded to the deep state, like Fauci, like Pompeo and others. absolutely wedded to the deep state, or ever really doing business with Mitch McConnell, who never meant President Trump well. Now, he had to. McConnell has power, and to some degree still has, though he is as demented as the figurehead. But at the RNC, there's been a trade, the big tent. They needed the big tent to win the race. So part of the big tent became saying goodbye to the Christian God. Saying to God, we don't want you involved. We're choosing other gods. They're literally saying that. Now, President Trump isn't, but the organization around him is. Moses wasn't saying, I want other gods. He knew the one and only God. He had looked in God's face. And when Moses saw God's face, it became such a glow on him that his own people couldn't look at his face. Moses wore a veil because of how his face had changed, having been exposed to the literal face of God Almighty. President Trump turned his head, avoided a bullet, is doing some of God's work. So was Moses. Moses was a godly guy. But around him, there were people holding orgies to false idols. Around President Trump, there are people speaking prayers to false gods in public. You'll hear one of these prayers in just a moment. Just pay attention to the matchup. I'm not calling President Trump Moses. I don't believe President Trump is as spiritually mature as Moses or anywhere near that. I believe he's been humbled. I think that became clear when he made fun of his hairstyle this past weekend and his comb over. It was funny. It's the first time I've seen President Trump truly self-effacing, making fun of himself. I think God has humbled President Trump, which must be why the demons are working around him to make sure other gods are featured. Moses never got to see the promised land. God told him in punishment for some disobedience, you're not going to get to go. A whole generation of people walked around the desert in a circle. They didn't get to go. God said, you have turned your back on me. You're going to spend your time in the desert. Your kids are going to learn to rely on me. Then they can go into the promised land. It wasn't punishment. It was accountability. President Trump had his life saved in the most miraculous happening, turning of his head away from his teleprompter to simply look at a chart that shows how the people who run Biden are destroying the country by breaking our immigration laws and by installing people here who do not care about our country. Hamid K. Dillon is a patriot. She's a patriotic American, a patriot lawyer. She ran to be head of the RNC. She also worships a false god, a Sikh god. And she, along with others, were allowed to lead prayers to a false god at the Republican National Convention. And there are people in the audience bowing their heads in prayer to a God they do not understand, a false God. This is horrifying.
Dear Waheguru, our one true God, we thank you for creating America as a unique haven on this earth where all people are free to worship according to their faith. We seek your blessings and guidance for our beloved country. Please bless our people with wisdom as they vote in the upcoming election. And please bless with humility, honesty, skill, and integrity all those who conduct the election. Finally, we thank you for the Chardi Kala spirit that we have witnessed in President Trump. That is, the tireless and uplifting spirit that is sustained even in the face of violent adversity, like a founding father centuries ago. And we thank you, dear God, for protecting his life. We thank you for his examples of nirbha, fearlessness, and nirvair, the absence of hate when faced with vitriol. These examples of extraordinary calm inspire us. Nanak Naam Chardi Kala Tere Bane Sarbatta Pala. May your name forever be exalted, spreading happiness and blessings and good spirit, that everyone may prosper and enjoy the grace of your peace. Thank you.
Hamid K. Dillon obviously has a right to have her own faith. She's a Sikh. And her God, the false God, is genderless. Genderless false God. It's one thing to have a woman speak, to offer her opinion, even to mention her faith. It's another thing to hold a prayer rally for false gods. the God of Islam has nothing to do with the God of the Bible. The God of the Sikhs has nothing to do with the God of the Bible. If you believe the Bible, Jesus said, I am the truth, the way, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but through me. If you believe the Bible, there is one God and one God only, that we're to worship him with our entire hearts, our entire souls, to love him, and then to love our neighbors as ourselves. It's not a loving thing to have your neighbors pray to a God that they don't understand and that is a false God. It's a history lesson. On one hand, God has rescued President Trump, which in my judgment is one way of rescuing America for a little while. For a little while. And on the other hand, behind the scenes, the planners, the smart people, the professional Republicans, though they've done a great job at the convention, drawing more numbers, highest views in history perhaps for a Republican convention, the turnaround in the black vote, the Hispanic vote, the tripling of support from black people for President Trump, they're squandering this. Would the convention have been less effective if Hamid K. Dillon had simply spoken and simply mentioned her faith than having a prayer to a false god? Would it have been fundamentally different? Less of a big tent? Maybe. Maybe. Would it be fundamentally different internally? Certainly. God saw his definition of marriage erased by the Republican National Committee during the week that God saved President Trump. Just fathom that for a moment. Just fathom it.